Thank you very much, Carl. My name is Eileen and I am an alcoholic. And I'm going to put myself on gallery view. I don't like to see myself up close. Thank you very much for asking me to participate in this meeting. I mean, this is a marathon effort on your part, getting speakers every single night of the week. But, you know, the beauty of the Zoom format is that, you know, we're able to experience speakers from everywhere and see our friends from everywhere. I know there are some people who don't like the Zoom format, and I had never even heard of Zoom before before the pandemic started. But I have to say that this has been a marvelous, marvelous, addition to my program. I mean, I feel very emotional about the fact that I can see friends who live all over the country, all over the world, all over Southern California. I went to my regular Monday morning women's meeting this morning. It's in Killarney, Ireland, and where I was supposed to go in a few days, but because of the pandemic, I'm not able to go. But because of the miracle of Zoom, every Monday morning, I go to a meeting with Irish and Scottish women in Killarney, Ireland. And that's fantastic. I love that. So this is my second meeting today, and at 7 o'clock, I'm going to another meeting. So, and I've never gone to so many meetings in my life. Even when I was new, I only went to 9 a week, and so, this has been great. Anyway, I'm feeling kind of emotional because I am so moved, by our worldwide fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and how we have pulled together in order to make it possible for us to continue our recovery, even on this very virtual basis. But, I have seen numerous newcomers in meetings, some of whom didn't get sober until after this pandemic started. And they are getting and staying sober on Zoom only. And that's a fantastic thing. So thank God for Zoom and Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm supposed to tell you a little bit about what I was like, what happened, and what I'm like now. For those of you who don't know me, my sobriety date is March 3rd, 1975. I celebrated 45 years of sobriety in March. I got sober 18 days shy of my 24th birthday, and I'm now 69 years old. And, I wouldn't have given you 2 nickels for my chances of staying in Alcoholics Anonymous from that day, until now. But, a very important 12-step work was being performed on me. And because of that, I have been able to stay here in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm a Jew from Idaho. If you know anything about Jews or Idaho, you know how unusual that actually is. There are a lot of Jews in Idaho to this day. My parents, whose names were Harry and Harriet, they were a set. My parents were from the Bronx in New York, and my father was a Marine, and he served in Guadalcanal in the South Pacific. He saw combat in Guadalcanal, and he came back from overseas, and he took a train across country. And a week after he got back from overseas, he and my mother got married in 1944. And then my father got a job in the Marine Corps. The war was winding down, but it was still on. But he got a job reopening Marine Corps recruiting stations in the Western United States. And so my parents moved first to Portland, Oregon, then briefly to Butte, Montana, and finally to Boise, Idaho. And my father got out of the service and he became a minor league baseball announcer and disc jockey in Boise. And, my dad was a real baseball guy. He was a lifelong Yankee fan. He was in Yankee Stadium when his idol Lou Gehrig gave the famous "I'm the luckiest man in the world" speech. I mean, he was there with 60,000 other people, but he was there. And, they lived there for 10 years. My mother and father and my brother and I were both born there. And in 1955, my dad got a job in Los Angeles in public relations, and we moved down to Los Angeles. And then the man who hired him to work in that firm died, and things changed. And then he joined an advertising agency called Weinberg Advertising, where he worked for the next 43 years. And I'm only telling you this story because the significance to Alcoholics Anonymous, to those of us in AA, about the significance of Weinberg advertising is because Weinberg advertising is where Clancy Imislund went to work in the mailroom after he got his teeth kicked out in the Phoenix jail and then moved to Los Angeles. He got a job in the mailroom of the advertising agency where my father was an advertising executive. And Clancy talks about how he wants to tell them, you know, he hears them in the conference room talking about their ad campaign for Kamchatka vodka and how, you know, they're talking about how it goes down. And he tries to tell his sponsor, but it doesn't. It goes down, kaboom, you know, and that was my father's account, Kamchatka vodka. So my dad and Clancy Imislund actually had a lifelong friendship. Clancy is still with us. My father passed away 2 years ago. But they maintained a friendship all the years of my dad's life after he met Clancy. And so anyway, that's just a little story from my life. And I was the star of my grammar school. I excelled at everything except for physical education and interpersonal relationships, but I was really good at everything else. And I peaked at about 11 and a half, and it was kind of downhill from there. And, you know, I grew up during the 60s, and the 60s were prime generation for alcoholics of my type, you know, and alcoholics of my type are the type that, you know, like to drink as much and often as they possibly can. And, you know, I always felt like a freak. There was really no reason for me to ever feel like a freak. You know, I really literally was born with everything you were supposed to have in order to make it. You know, I was born with looks and talent and brains and opportunity and a supportive family. You know, my parents stayed married for 63 years until actually this Thursday, 13 years ago, my mother died very suddenly, but they were married for a very, very long time and would have never split up had she not died. And anyway, you know, but I was also born, I believe, with alcoholism. And because of that, I was born with what the big book describes as the peculiar mental twist, you know, and I always had a peculiar mental twist, and I probably still have a peculiar mental twist, but now it doesn't bother me, you know, but I was just a freak. And, you know, the 60s provided the opportunity for freaks to find one another and just freak out, you know. And I don't think that everybody, you know, AA is loaded with people of my vintage, and not all of them, you know, took Timothy Leary's, you know, admonition to heart to tune in, turn on, and drop out. But I did. I loved everything about the 60s. I loved the drugs, I loved the alcohol, I loved the politics, I loved, you know, the free love, which turned out to be neither free nor love. But I loved everything about the 60s. I loved the clothes, I loved the music, I loved, you know, I just loved it all. And those were my people, you know, those were my people. And I remember I went to live on a commune in Washington in 1970 or 71. It was in eastern Washington, outside a little town called Davenport near Spokane. It was called Tolstoy Farm. I mean, the whole thing was insane, you know, because Jews don't camp, I mean, basically. And I go to live on this commune, you know, with this guy that I know hates me in Los Angeles, but it's going to be different in Washington. And it was worse. But I remember, you know, I had run away from home, and I'd written my parents, you know, a letter. And the letter said, you know, I'm finally with the beautiful people, the ones who understand me. And, you know, the truth of the matter is, it wasn't until I got to Alcoholics Anonymous that I actually found the beautiful people, you know, the ones who relentlessly understood me. And anyway, I drank and used for a total of 12 years. That's all it took. You know, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous talks about how sometimes women alcoholics are gone beyond recall in just a few short years. And that was the case with me. You know, when I was in my mid-teens, I was a heartbreakingly beautiful hippie girl. You know, I had black hair down to my butt. I was, you know, I was beautiful. I had porcelain skin. I was gorgeous. And the truth is, you know, I used it because I had to. I had to get a source, you know, because when you're a teenage alcoholic, it's hard to get a source. But if you're a beautiful young girl, you know, you can do what I like to call favors for older guys, and, you know, they'll get you what you need. You know, because you'll give them what they need and they'll get you what they need. It was you know, it was a business arrangement. And when I was 17, I was doing a favor for a drug dealer named Gimpy, and I got pregnant. And I simply refused to believe I was pregnant. You know, reality and I didn't have much of a relationship even then. And, you know, and so I refused to believe I was pregnant. And by the time I finally went and got a pregnancy test, I was 4.5 months pregnant. And it was 1968 and abortion was illegal, but there were still ways to do things, but not in my case. I was way too far gone. And in March of 1969, I had a child. I never saw him. I never held him. When he was 3 days old, I signed papers and I gave my child away. And I drank and used for 6 more years, and I could never bear to think about it. And, you know, my drinking and using just got worse and worse and worse. And, you know, I didn't get into a lot of trouble with the police. I didn't spend a lot of time in mental institutions. I did, you know, go and get a lot of therapy. But I never went to therapy for my drinking. I went to therapy to unravel the fascinating mystery of me. And, you know, and every therapist I had was weirder than the previous therapist because, you know, those were the people I was seeking. And, you know, I had never heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. In 1974, when I went to my first meeting at age 23, AA was a much more anonymous organization than it is now. And I don't believe that the organization, by the way, you know, I get into arguments with people about this all the time, that AA is not an anonymous organization. The people are anonymous, but the organization is not. If the organization was completely anonymous, how would any of us ever find it? I mean, it's kind of crazy that people say, well, you know, we shouldn't, you know, advertise or anything. Well, you know, we shouldn't promote and we shouldn't advertise, but the organization is not anonymous. But back then it was pretty anonymous. But central office in Los Angeles used to do a very, very, very clever thing. And what they would do, for you kids, we didn't used to have 24-hour television, if you can believe it. And in the middle of the night, where there usually would be a test pattern, this black and white thing, and I remember there was like an Indian in the middle. It was weird. But in the middle of the night, you know, so AA central office in Los Angeles would buy space on late night television. And it would, I guess they would buy it at like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, you know, when an alcoholic would sort of come to in front of their TV and like not know what time or what day or whatever, you know, it was when you pass out in front of your TV and the TV is on. And there was a single card on my television and it said, "Do you have a drinking problem?" And I thought, how do they know? You know, it was like there was a phantom living in the television and there was a telephone number to call. And for some unknown reason, I called the number. And a man answered the phone and he said, "Alcoholics Anonymous, may we help you?" And I said, "I think I drink too much." And he said, "Would you like me to have somebody call you?" And I said, "Okay." And he woke a total stranger up in the middle of the night. And of course, you know, years later, I was the total stranger that got woken up in the middle of the night. But I couldn't believe that he had woken this woman up in the middle of the night. And she called me. And she said to me, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I think I drink too much." And she said, "Would you like me to take you to a meeting?" And I said, "Oh, no, thank you." I said, "I'll get there myself." I came to Alcoholics Anonymous like this: help me. Stay as far away from me as possible, but please help me. I was not a cuddly newcomer. I was not a vision for you. You know how sometimes there's like a really cute newcomer and everybody races across the room to get to him, you know, and, you know, people are stumbling all over each other to get to the newcomer. I was the newcomer that everybody more likely would race across the room to get away from. You know, I was hostile, I was frightened, I leaned against walls with arms folded, glared at people. I came around for 5 months in 1974 and I did not get sober. I don't even call it slipping, I just didn't get sober. But I came to meetings periodically. And when the holiday weekend for Christmas, New Year, 74, 75 rolled around, I left AA completely because there was no point in being in AA not sober during the holidays. And I had this therapist. Like I said, I always had therapists. And I'm not here to knock therapy, by the way. The big book has no conflict with seeking outside help if we need it. I have never confused therapy with sponsorship. Sponsorship and Alcoholics Anonymous are the only therapy that I have ever used for my alcoholism. But I've had some issues that I have needed to work out in therapy, and no one in AA should or be expected to help me with certain things. But these therapists that I had, they were just all weird. So my final therapist before I got sober was a guy named Sid, and he was blind, and we used to smoke dope and neck during my sessions. So, you know, I was getting an enormous amount of help from Sid. And Sid persuaded me to go to this place called the Benneville Pines up in the San Bernardino Mountains. It's a church camp, but it's run by the Unitarians, and they're loose. And I only agreed to go after Sid assured me that they would have liquor at the Benneville Pines. You know, and I had to drive, of course, because he was blind, and I would have just left him there. I would have just dumped him there if there was no evidence of liquor. But we got up there, and they were unloading a lot of gallon jugs of wine out of the back of a station wagon, so I was happy. And anyway, I spent the entire weekend completely inebriated, having a three-way with a couple of sex therapists from Carpinteria, California, whose names were Bert and Sally. I don't know why I remembered their names. I guess I thought I would look them up, which I never did. Not because there's anything particularly wrong with a three-way, a two-way, a one-way, anything. I don't care, but they were creepy. And so I just didn't look them up ever, you know. And anyway, I came back to Alcoholics Anonymous. I had a vague plan to come back after the first of the year, but my birthday is March 3rd, so it took me a couple extra months to make it back here. And it wasn't because any huge event happened. It was really because I had gotten an impression of Alcoholics Anonymous back in '74, which I hold to this day. And it was only in retrospect that I look back and know that I thought this. I thought AA is good, it's decent, it's wholesome, it's unhip. I was so sick of being hip. You know, I used to have a friend who used to say he was so cool, he was frozen. And I identify with that. I've spent the last 45 years thawing out, you know, and people seem nice to one another. And it didn't seem like they wanted anything. And you know, where I was coming from, if you did something nice for somebody, it's because you wanted something. And if somebody did something nice for you, it's because they wanted something. And I knew by the time I got back to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous that I had nothing to offer. You know, my beauty was gone. My self-respect was gone. You know, the two overwhelming emotions that I had when I came back to AA were complete and total disappointment in the way that my life had turned out, because it wasn't supposed to be like that, and utter and absolute self-hatred for who I had become. And, you know, as a result of my alcoholic drinking. And anyway, I came back on March 3rd. On March 4th, I went to the old Radford Clubhouse when it was on Radford in North Hollywood, and I ran into a man that I had met the previous year. His name was Bob Earl. And Bobby backed me up against the wall in that meeting, and he said to me, "Look, punk," he said, "you have a serious problem with alcohol and drugs, and you better damn well get sober or you're going to die." And then he said, "And if you don't get sober, I'm going to break your jaw." Now, I don't know what you would have thought. I thought he cares. You know, I'd heard you guys cared, you know, and the truth is he cared. You know, lots of people had given me their phone numbers in 1974, and I'd taken those stupid little scraps of paper out of my pockets and thrown them away at the end of the night. But I took Bobby's phone number, and the miracle was I called him. But the bigger miracle was I called him a second time, because the first time I called him completely unsolicited by me, he started telling me what to do. Now, I don't know what you're like. I don't like people telling me what to do, especially if I haven't asked them. I mean, they are not kidding when they say that defiance is the outstanding characteristic of the alcoholic. It certainly was me. And the things that Bobby told me to do were to go to 7 to 9 meetings a week, to sit in the front row, to be responsible for my chair and my ashtray, to thank speakers whether I thought they had anything to say or not, to get a big book and read it, to get a meeting commitment. He told me that I was essentially useless, but I had a car and I could drive other people to meetings. Now, I didn't like any of these suggestions because it seemed to me they involved interaction with other people, and I didn't really care for other people. And fortunately for me, not one sponsor, including my current sponsor, Shirley P., has been the least bit interested in my opinion about the direction that they are giving me. Not one. They sort of assume that if I would want what they have, I might try to do what they did. You know, the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is not a program of osmosis. I mean, you know, you can derive enormous benefit from sitting in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And according to our 12-step and the 12 and 12, that is part of our 12-step work. And I have been to literally thousands and thousands of meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous everywhere. But where the program is in the steps, in the books, in being of service. You know, service is the thing that has saved me time and time again. You know, Alcoholics Anonymous provides us not only opportunities to be of service in the rooms, but it teaches us how to be of service, you know, in our community and to other people in our lives and to our families. And, you know, I have been able to take full advantage of everything that I have learned in Alcoholics Anonymous in the last 45 years. You know, I always think it's so funny, you know, when speakers say in some sort of a folksy way, you know, the longer I'm sober, the less I know. And I think, Jesus, haven't you been paying attention? You know, there's a lot of good information here. I mean, everything that I know about living on the planet that's worth knowing, I literally have learned in Alcoholics Anonymous, from, you know, from meeting commitments, from being of service, you know, from learning the lesson that you cannot think yourself into right action, but you can act yourself into right thinking, that you can act better than you feel, you know, that you can go out of your way to ask other people how they are, even if you don't care, and eventually you start caring, you know. And so I started doing everything that Bobby told me to do. And I became an active member of Alcoholics Anonymous. My first commitment in AA was shaking hands at the door of a meeting called Wilshire, Normandy. It was then the biggest meeting in Alcoholics Anonymous in LA. It was on Sunday nights in a church at the corner of Wilshire and Normandy. That's why they called it that. You know, my old friend Serenity Sam, who some of you knew, gave me a meeting directory from 1966, and I decided to thumb through it to find like some amusing meeting names. Here's my favorite: the No Donut Group in Pomona. And I just think, what is this? Like a bunch of humorless old farts sitting around, you know, saying, oh no, we're not going to have our meeting adulterated by pastry. You know, we're not even going to have any coffee, like nothing to dilute the message, you know. And I think, thank God there were meetings that had donuts, because I was poor and I was hungry, you know. And thank God there were meetings that had snacks. You know, I combed LA for meetings that had snacks, you know, because I was hungry and poor. But anyway, so I was the greeter at this huge meeting. Everybody came to Wilshire, young, old, gay, straight, every ethnicity, every religious background, men, women, I mean, old, young, rich, poor, everybody came to Wilshire. I mean, it was a real melting pot. And, you know, I had no life, so I would get there at like, you know, an hour and a half early. And I had a place where I like to stand by the door, and I would literally put my keys on the floor, and God help you if you stood there, because it was my place. And I was a hostile greeter. You got greeted whether you wanted to be or not. And if you tried to go around the pass, we'd intercept you. And people started recognizing me as the weirdo girl from the door at Wilshire, Normandy, and they invited me to coffee at this terrible coffee shop on Western Avenue called Piper's, where we ate bad food and smoked cigarettes and drank coffee and stayed up till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. And that's where I started making lifelong friends. You know, and one of the beauties of this Zoom is that I'm seeing people, I know hundreds of people in Alcoholics Anonymous at this point, and I'm seeing people everywhere. I mean, here I'm looking at my friend Diane, I'm seeing Sheridan, you know, I know that Joe is here from San Diego. I mean, it's like a miracle to be able to go to these meetings and see people from everywhere, you know, that you don't get to see regularly because we don't live in the same place or go to the same meetings. But, you know, every single Zoom meeting that I've gone to, I've literally been surprised at who has actually, you know, like sort of shown up. I mean, it's kind of fun to see who's going to show up in all of these different meetings. You know, I go to a meeting on Saturday nights, which I go to in real life too. That's based on the interview meeting in Long Beach, where Diane interviewed me actually, but there's one now in Sherman Oaks. And I mean, you know, people are coming there from all over the country, not only to speak, but to attend. And it's like the most wonderful thing, you know. So anyway, I got involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I have never not been involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's been, there's been 45 years of life. There's been drama. There's been relationships. There's been no relationships. There's been, profound depression at one point. I've traveled all over the world, sometimes with AA, sometimes on my own dime. I have had great adventures, and I've had really hard times. I've lost both my parents in Alcoholics Anonymous, like I said. Thursday is the 13th anniversary of my mother's death, and I was in Dallas, Texas. I had spoken at a convention, and I got a call from my brother that my father had taken my mother to the hospital. And those were the days before you could get any information on a plane. And I got on the plane, and I flew back to Los Angeles, and my then boyfriend picked me up at the airport, and we went to the hospital. And my mother, who had been fine the day before, was in a state of delirium. And anyway, I got to see her at 5:30, and then we were asked to leave the hospital briefly while they changed shifts. And my mother, who was fine the day before, was dead by 7:45 that evening. And my father was demolished. My father, I've never seen a more heartbroken human being in my life. They had been married, like I said, for almost 63 years. He was 86 years old. He had never lived alone. He had gone from his family to the Marine Corps to marriage with my mother at 23. And we didn't know what to do. It was the absolute worst day of our lives, the worst day of our lives. And so I went and stayed with my father for a couple of months. And then for the next 7 years, I stayed with my father 3 or 4 nights a week. I went back and forth between my apartment and his condominium here in Brentwood, because I could not bear the thought of my father eating a solitary breakfast every single morning. It broke my heart. My father was the Prince of Men. And when he was well enough, we traveled to Europe, my brother and sister-in-law and my dad and I. We found the town in Poland that his family came from. We had a tremendous experience. When he was still well enough, we traveled to New York. We traveled to the Northwest. I have a lot of family up in Washington and Oregon. We went to Las Vegas. We went to San Diego. We went to San Francisco. I took him to baseball games. His hearing was terrible at the end of his life. But one of the things that he could still hear was classical music, and I would take him to our beautiful Disney Hall so that he could sit in ecstasy and listen to music. And at the beginning of 2018, I knew my father was not going to live through the year. I could just tell he was fading away. He was 96 years old. And anyway, on the night of March 14th of 2018, we went out to dinner. We had Chinese food. We went back to his place. He moved to a senior place 4 years before he died. I still saw him 3 or 4 times a week. And we went back to his place and we watched Jeopardy, and he got a lot of answers in the form of a question. My father was completely compos mentis. And sometime in the middle of the night, he got a massive cerebral hemorrhage. And in the morning, he was in a coma. And they took him to the hospital, and I went and I sat with him. And they took him for his CAT scan, and they brought him back. And I said, "There's no hope, right?" And they said, "No." And then, "I want you to do 3 things for me. I want you to make sure he's in no pain. I want you to keep him impeccably clean. And I want you to let him go." And I went and I sat in the hospital room with him, and they took very loving care of him. He was on the gerontology floor at UCLA Santa Monica. And I sat with him all day, and I wouldn't leave the room, and I drank juice out of juice boxes and ate graham crackers, and I sat and I sat. And at 4:21 that afternoon, my dad took his last breath, and it was a privilege to take care of my father. It was inconvenient, it was hard, it was heartbreaking. I had to change plans, I had to alter things, I had to reschedule surgeries, I had to cancel my trip to the International in Atlanta because he needed emergency surgery 3 days before the convention. I had to make many, many adjustments and changes in my life, but I managed to adjust and make all those changes because in Alcoholics Anonymous, I learned how to do what I like to call the inconvenient thing. And in many cases, the inconvenient thing is putting on a pair of pants and leaving the house. But in this case, in many ways, it was inconvenient. It was inconvenient. But you know what? AA turned me into somebody who was not profoundly selfish. I am no longer profoundly selfish. In fact, I'm pretty selfless a lot of the time. You know, I've had a spiritual awakening of the educational variety that they talk about in the back of the book. I've had a change of attitude. You know, I was a miserable malcontent when I came to the program, and I'm a fairly positive person. You know, I wouldn't say that I am sailing through this pandemic, but I'm certainly handling it a lot better than I would be if I didn't have the program. And I'm certainly handling it a lot better than I would be if I was drinking. I mean, I can't even imagine. You know, they're starting to open like bars and restaurants, and, you know, people are not socially distancing. Man, I'd be right in there, not socially distancing, drinking, going home with people, you know, who knows? I don't know. You know, but AA has turned me into a responsible citizen, you know, and I didn't like those kind of words. You know, when I was new, the words that I thought were dirty were not profanity. I'm not swearing tonight, but those who know me and love me know that I really like to swear. I like profanity. It's fun. It's like, you know, putting seasoning on your conversation. But you know, in Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, the words that I thought were dirty were like job, you know, commitment, responsibility. How about this one? Here's a good one. Cooperation. Cooperation. Learning how to cooperate, not only in Alcoholics Anonymous, but in the community, with your family, with your employer. I've had the same job for 32 years. I'm a personal assistant in the entertainment industry. You know, if I'm asked to buy dog food, I buy dog food. If I'm invited to go to the Academy Awards, I go to the Academy Awards. I mean, and everything in between. And I don't think anything is beneath me, you know, because I'm a pretty cooperative person. You know, but I have cooperated during this pandemic. I'm a senior. They asked me to stay at home a week before they asked everybody else to stay at home. So you know what I did? I stayed at home. You know, I only go out when it's necessary. I go to the market at senior opening early in the morning. I have a list. I'm in and out in 15 minutes. I can do 5 bags and $136 in 15 minutes. You know, I know how to do it. You know, and I go places where I need to go, and otherwise I stay home. And I sit in my living room on Sunset Boulevard, otherwise known as the Judgment Lounge. And I stare out my window and I judge people on their terrible mask wear and lack of social distancing. You know, I mean, so you know what? I mean, the difference is I don't go out in the yard and yell at them. I just silently judge. And I'm not above that, you know. I mean, I think people are behaving terribly, but it's not my business. Anyway, I'm going to tell you one more story and then I'm going to stop, because it's a good story. If you think that there's going to come a time in your life where everything is going to be wrapped up in a nice, neat little package, you know, and nothing's ever going to intervene. I mean, you know, I've had 8 orthopedic surgeries since 1992. I've had everything replaced. I am the bionic woman, you know, and those things have actually been very instructive as well, because my first surgery, I wouldn't let anybody help me. I had a cast up to my knee, put together a 6-foot-tall bookcase from IKEA myself and stood it up against the wall. By my 8th surgery, which was my second knee replacement, anything that anybody asked me, I just said yes. Because I discovered somewhere along the way that if being of service is such a gift for me, then I cannot deny others the gift of being of service to me. It is a spiritual gift to allow other people to help you. So if you're new, and I know there are people from both of the recovery houses here, I want to tell you this. We are here to help. And not only do we want to help, but our lives depend on being able to help you. I hope that you're hearing what I have to say. My life depends on being able to get out of my selfish, self-centered state of mind to help you. So I want to help you. I want to be of service wherever and whenever I can. Anyway, to get back to the good story, I got a little sidetracked. To get back to the good story, so in July of 96, actually, July 4th, 1996, which makes it easy for me to remember this date, I was sitting on my couch, drinking a large cup of coffee, staring out the window, different window, I was living in a different place, thinking that at some point, looking forward to having 4 days off of work, thinking at some point I'd get up, I'd go to the store. I buy the stuff for the salad I promised to bring to the barbecue later that day. And my phone rang, and it was a woman. And she said, "My name is Julie Jones, and I'm a private search investigator from Seattle, Washington, and I have been asked to locate you." And I swear to you, I had no idea why she was calling. And then she said, "Is your name Ilene Waterstone?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Does the date March 28th, 1969 mean anything to you?" And of course I knew that was the day my son was born. And I'm kind of dramatic if you haven't already figured this out. And I started to cry, and I went, "Is he in Seattle?" You know, like big, ugly tears. And she said, "Oh no." She said, "We do this all by computer." She said, "Your son lives in your area code." My son was living a mile and a half away from me 27 years later. But wait, it gets better. When my son was 16, which was 11 years earlier than that, he was friends with the daughter of a woman that I sponsored, and he was in her home, but nobody knew he was my son. But wait, it gets better. There is a bar in Hollywood called Jumbo's Clown Room. I used to drive by it when I was newly sober and think, shit, I'm so sorry I never drank in there. That bar has the best name, you know? What I didn't realize is it's a strip bar. And my son was the doorman at this strip bar, which means nothing except that the strip bar is owned by a man named Jack, who is the grandfather of my niece's then husband. So my son was working for my niece's mother-in-law, but nobody knew he was my son. Anyway, she said, "Can I give him your phone number?" I said, "No." I said, "Give me his. Tell him I'm really happy, but I need to call him after I do a couple of things, you know, like pick my stomach up from the floor." I mean, because I had made the decision years earlier that I was not going to search. I felt it was an invasion of his privacy and that of the people who adopted him. And I had heard horror stories about people going to look for their kids who didn't even know they were adopted. Although I actually knew that he knew he was adopted. I did make inquiry about him one time. But anyway, I said, I need to call him. And I called my parents who weren't home, thank God. I called my sponsor who was home, thank God. I called a couple of people I knew who had adopted kids. And then I called him and I said, "My name is Ilene Waterstone, and I understand you're looking for me." And in our first conversation, without knowing anything about me, he told me he had been in a rehab 2 years earlier. Now, considering the details of his conception, I was not stunned. You know, but I could tell by the tone of the conversation that he was not currently rehabbing. So I thought, oh, what the hell? So I said, "Hey," I said, "what an amazing coincidence." I said, "I have 21 years in Alcoholics Anonymous." And I was like, oh shit, oh God, she knows, you know, she knows. And anyway, I went to meet him 3 days later, except for the fact that he's 6'3", half Mexican and a guy. We look exactly alike. And my son has gone in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous for 26 years. You know, the first 10 years I knew him, it was touch and go. The last 2 years, it was really bad. Then he got sober. He met somebody like Bobby who he would listen to, and he was sober, and he was sober for quite a few years. Then he started lying about it. And then he finally copped to it, and he went to a rehab out in the desert a couple of years ago, and he got sober again. And then in recent times, you know, he was doing the same thing. He stops going to meetings and he starts drinking. He'll drink a couple of beers, then he'll drink a couple of more beers, then he'll take some pills, then he'll drink more beers, and so it starts. But a few weeks ago, something happened. Well, one of the things that happened is my grandson, who's 17, and really the adult in the room, said to my son, "Dad, I really want you to get sober again." And my son heard him. And he started going to Zoom meetings. Now, my son also has bipolar disorder. He has trouble getting to places on time. He is on fire for AA right now. He can go to 2 meetings a day. He has no trouble getting to the meetings. He can do it from the comfort of his home or his car or wherever. And I thank God for this Zoom format because it has gotten him re-involved in AA in a way that I haven't seen in years. We have had great conversations. He has said to me, "I don't want to lie to you." I said, "Honey, I don't want you to lie to me. I want you to tell me the truth." I said, you know what? Alcoholics sometimes get loaded. I said, obviously I'm happier when you're sober because you're happier and because you stand a chance of living. I mean, my son had a drug-induced heart attack when he was 35. He did so much cocaine that he had a heart attack. And, but he is on fire for AA right now. At 7 o'clock, we will be going to the same meeting. We will be in the same meeting with people that he used to know years ago at a meeting that we used to go in the Valley called Dickens. It's the Kester reunion meeting, and he's going to see people that he used to know, people who still ask me about him, people who love him. You know what? And I love my son. He is my 51-year-old alcoholic son, and I love him because he's just like me. And I always thank God that I was the one that he found on the other end of the phone line, because I've heard horror stories about that too. My mom didn't want to meet me. My mom is a drunk. My mom was dead. I was the best possible person to be on the other end of that line because of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the person that AA turned me into. I'm going to close with this. Many, many, many years ago, I had the joy of sharing the lectern with Father Terry at 9604 in South Central LA on a Christmas Eve. And Terry closed with this, and I always give him credit. He said, not only am I grateful to still be sober, he said, I'm grateful that I'm still happy about it. Thank you very much. I love Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you, Carl, for the privilege of speaking at this meeting.